Hi, it's Sarah. Brooke and I are taking a short break from recording new episodes to catch up on our reading lists and plan for the next season of Clued in Mystery. While we're off, we are re-releasing a few of our favorite episodes. We hope you enjoy. Welcome to Clued in Mystery. I'm Sarah.
And I'm Brooke, and we both love mystery. Before we get started today, I have another podcast I'd like to recommend to our mystery-loving listeners. It's called Mystery Rats Maze Podcast by Kings River Life. Their episodes consist of mystery short stories and first chapters of mystery novels read and brought to life by professional narrators and actors. I've listened to a few episodes already and have grown my ever-expanding TBR list. You can find Mystery Rats Maze Podcast on all your favorite apps or on their website, which is mysteryratsmaze.podbean.com, and we'll list that in our show notes.
Brooke, today we're going to talk about Dorothy L. Sayers, and I'm really looking forward to this.
I know, I am too. I feel like a broken record. I had so much to learn once again, and it was a really fun time learning more about this other pioneer of the mystery genre.
And I feel like I could have spent even longer learning about her. There just seems to be so much to her. And I feel like, we'll talk about her, but as with Christie and Doyle, we're really just going to scratch the surface of her personality and her writing, I think. But let's get started.
For sure.
Dorothy Lee Sayers was an only child born in 1893 in Oxford, England. She attended a boarding school in Salisbury and went on to graduate in 1915 with first-class honours from Somerville College, Oxford University, where she studied modern languages and medieval literature. Although at the time she finished, women weren't granted degrees, she was awarded one a few years later when the university changed its policy. In 1916, Blackwell Publishing published Sayers' first book of poetry and would go on to publish another in 1918. She actually ended up working for Blackwell for a period of time. In addition to her experience in publishing, she also worked in advertising and is credited with famous campaigns for Guinness Beer and Coleman Mustard. And it was during this time that Whose Body was published, which is the first of 14 novels and stories featuring Lord Peter Wimsey as a sleuth. When she finished the Wimsey series, she turned to writing plays and writing works with more religious theme, including translating Dante, which was a passion for her and what she considered to actually be her best work. In total, she published 16 novels, 10 plays, 6 translations, and 24 nonfiction works. Her father was a reverend in the Church of England, and I think it's that she grew up in religious circles that really influenced her writing religious works. I found reference to her being offered an honorary doctorate of divinity that she actually declined because, she didn't feel like she had enough to warrant that. In terms of her personal life, in 1926, she married a Scottish journalist, Captain Oswald Atherton Fleming. She actually had a son following a relationship with another man before her marriage to Fleming. And the boy was raised by her aunt and her cousin, which allowed her to play a role in the boy's life. She moved away from writing detective novels shortly before the start of the Second World War, and that's when that shift to her focus on Christian works and translations happened. And she's often associated with many literary figures, including the Inklings, which is a literary discussion group of Oxford academics that included J.R.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, and others. Although she, from what I read, never actually attended any of their meetings. But she was a founding member of the Detection Club, which included several mystery writers, or is made exclusively up of mystery writers, and included Agatha Christie and G.K. Chesterton, who wrote the Father Brown series. She served as the club's third president from 1949 to 1957. And I was fascinated by this club. I think I'd heard of it before, But, they have this very elaborate initiation ceremony. They have to commit to the rules of fair play detection, and they would co-write stories. So I just can imagine this wonderful environment that they've created, and it still exists, right? Like it's invitation only.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah, to become a member. Yeah, it would be, I just can imagine these fascinating conversations that they must have had. But the set of fair play rules that they established, they're largely followed by today's mystery authors, right? They just really set some of those rules that we've talked about a little bit in some of our other episodes. The origin of those seems to be certainly formalized with the Detection Club. She was, I think, I read something about her, insisting on wearing trousers, which at the time would have been perhaps not super well accepted in terms of the fashion of the day. It would have set her apart as a very perhaps opinionated woman.
Yeah.
But she was, I think, passionate about mystery and passionate about writing. And we can talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah. I think that she was a very confident and independent woman. Some of the things that I read was that she had a very outgoing kind of big personality and maybe was even a little bit hard to get along with. And I don't know if we would say that the same now or if it was just in that time period for a woman. She was very outgoing and very confident. And I was reading some things about her early life and found some things that I thought were similar to Agatha Christie, which was fun. They both taught themselves to read by the age of 4. And so,
fascinating.
Yeah. And they also had fairly large houses with lawns and grounds that they could explore. And I remembered that we talked about that with Agatha as well. Agatha had her imaginary friends. And I read that Dorothy, her only playmate was a cousin, Marguerite, who she saw intermittently. And so she entertained herself with 2 stuffed monkeys, one named Jacko and one named Jocko. One was good and one was evil. And a villainous rag doll that she called a Frenchman. I just thought that was so cute.
I love that.
I know. It's great.
That's wonderful.
They have these storytelling minds, even as little girls. So that was really great. But something very different from Agatha is that, and you alluded to it because she went on to get a college degree. She was highly educated as a child and learned Latin and various other languages and lots of music and literature. I think you're right. That really shaped her, along with having a father who was in the ministry, in her interests in philosophy and theology and religion.
I think you see that influence of her education, certainly in the whimsy stories that I read. There's quotes from literature at the beginning of each chapter. And I think that's one of the criticisms that I read about whimsy was that he was perhaps a little too educated. He was a bit too rich. He was a bit too much. But I read a really interesting quote from her about him because she started writing those stories when she was, living on her own in London, working in an ad agency and didn't have a lot of money. And so essentially, she was talking about how he was her escape, right? And so if she was craving a nice meal, she would let whimsy eat a nice meal. And she was kind of living vicariously through him. She gave him a really nice car because that was something that, she didn't have. He had this very lavish lifestyle that, she did not. Yeah. So the quote from Whimsy or about Whimsy was, "And at that time I was particularly hard up. When I was dissatisfied with my single unfurnished room, I took a luxurious flat for him in Piccadilly. When my cheap rug got a hole in it, I ordered an Abusan carpet. When I had no money to pay my bus fare, I presented him with a Daimler 66, upholstered in a style of sober magnificence, and when I felt dull, I let him drive it."
Oh, that's so fabulous.
When I read that quote, it reminded me that as an author, you can create that world for yourself. Right. And for your characters. And by extension, that world exists for your readers. And I thought that was really interesting.
I thought the same thing. I thought, man, I need to make myself a very wealthy character in my series so that I can, that's a really fun thing to do. Or for instance, I am not very sporty, so I could make this, incredibly athletic person who, wins all the golf tournaments and live vicariously through her.
Yeah, I had a very similar thought, and it was, I'm going to write a character who's very, very assertive.
Yes. Oh, perfect. I love it.
That was really interesting. And she loved mystery. And I read, it was the introduction to a anthology of crime writing. Yeah. Anyway, she wrote about writing, or sorry, not about writing, wrote about mysteries, really advocated for mystery authors to create fuller characters to engage their readers. Her concern was that if the mystery is just like a crossword puzzle, if it's one dimensional or not deep enough, then it won't engage readers. And so she really wanted characters that readers fell in love with. And I think as an author, that's really terrific advice, right?
Yes.
If I think about Louise Penny and Ian Rankin, I read them as much for the mystery as I do for the detectives that they've created. And I think you need to have both of that for a reader to really fall in love with the piece.
Those are definitely my favorite types of mysteries, so that you get the storyline that is the mystery and the puzzle to figure out, but that you're also invested in those characters and that you have a character arc, which actually is something that we see in the whimsy stories that we don't necessarily see in Poirot and Sherlock Holmes. Poirot and Sherlock Holmes are essentially static characters throughout the entirety of the series. We've talked a little bit, there are some changes towards the end, but essentially they're the same person. And Whimsy changes. At the beginning, when she's writing, he's young. And when her series finishes up, he's middle-aged. He goes from being a single, kind of immature and in the first stories, to a family man who's married to Harriet Vane, which I hear is a character that she based quite a bit on herself. So we definitely have a character arc in her work.
Yeah. And I think that's really, again, I just think that's really good advice for authors to be thinking about, right? That, there needs to be something for readers to be invested in. Right. I can imagine that readers they probably had opinions about Whimsy getting married. Right.
For sure.
And I think actually she had an opinion about it because one of the things that she talks about in this, it's the introduction to the Omnibus of Crime, 1928 to 1929. One of the things that she talks about in there is that she doesn't think that there's a large place for romance in mystery, that really the focus should be on the mystery. But she, as you say, Whimsy ends up getting married. And then I read, I don't think this was her criticism. I think it was someone else's criticism of the final Whimsy book, where it's, he's on honeymoon and the mystery is sort of really the subplot to what is essentially a love story. And so I haven't read that final book in this series. So I can't speak to my opinion on that, but, I think it's interesting. She would have changed her own mind because she would have written that final book after she'd written this introduction to the Omnibus of Crime.
Right. And I think I read that criticism as well. And I too haven't read the book, but there were definitely detection fiction fans that didn't feel like there was enough of a mystery in that final book. And I find it really interesting that you said that she didn't really feel like there was a great place for romance and mystery, because I feel like in her own life, she was an actual romantic. She had a lot of sort of I guess, turbulent love affairs. She kind of had some on again, off again things with a couple of fellows. And then, she had the hidden pregnancy. She kept that a secret from her family and kept the boy a secret from her parents, and didn't make it known really until he was an adult. I think there was a lot of romance in her life. So maybe she couldn't help herself but give whimsy Harriet Vane.
So the other thing in this introduction to the omnibus of crime is she talks about kind of the history of the genre. And I had to keep reminding myself that it was the history until 1928 or 1929 when she wrote this, right? But she talks about Poe being one of the kind of real fathers of at the time would be modern mystery, right? She actually talks about how mystery, appears in kind of classic stories and fables and detection, how characters detect in the way that Sherlock does. And then she draws a line between the formal establishment of police forces in England and the public's general interest in detective stories, that the establishment of the police force needed to happen for people to become really interested in mystery. And she also credits the Industrial Revolution and resulting advances in technology with creating the circumstances that shifted the focus from knights and adventurers to policemen as protectors.
Oh, that is so interesting.
Yeah. I thought that was really interesting. I think she is one of the people that if someone, said you can have dinner with 6 people of your choosing, live or dead, I think she's one of the people that I would choose to have dinner with, because she just seemed like a really fascinating person. Wouldn't she have been a wonderful guest to have on our podcast?
Goodness. Yeah, absolutely.
But she was concerned that detective mystery or detective fiction or mystery fiction would lose favor with audiences because of the risk that characters were drawn kind of too thin, and that what did she say? It was something like, after someone has read half a dozen stories by a certain author, the reader understands the author well enough to predict the solutions to their mysteries, and so would grow bored. And she certainly had in the books that I've read very interesting methods of death.
Definitely.
I guess that was her way, one of the ways that she wanted to capture audiences' interests.
Definitely. So I was wondering about this. Remember when we talked with our interviewees, Sherry T. Mitchell and Chronicles of Crime, and we were talking about the idea that Agatha writes so simply, right? It's a very... there's simple stories to read and understand and enter into the genre. And then we also contrasted that and said, you know what, but Doyle, it wasn't simple, it's complex writing and this and that. So I was trying to put Sayers on that continuum. And where do you think that she fits? Because I certainly don't think that they're as simple and accessible as Christie, but I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
I would agree with that. I think, she's not as accessible as Christie, but perhaps more accessible than Doyle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's kind of where I kind of put her in the middle.
And part of that may be that she was writing certainly later than Doyle was writing his Sherlock story. So, Whimsy had more technology, there's fingerprints and some of those forensic sciences that Sherlock was responsible for, right, were being used. And so as a reader, it's kind of easier to picture or to imagine a world where those are available, right? But I think I would put Dorothy in the middle.
Mm-hmm. And you can definitely see when you're reading her stories, her love and her fascination with philosophy and theology, because sometimes you have a character sort of go off on a little tangent talking about, the way they think about something or the way the world works or something. And she still brings in some of those themes into a murder mystery. It's pretty interesting.
I really liked that about her work because it was in Unnatural Death, where there's this conversation essentially about assisted suicide or assisted death.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought it was really interesting. It reminded me that this is something that people would have been thinking about almost 100 years ago, right?
Yeah.
That it's not a new concept necessarily. And yeah, I thought that was really interesting that she brought that in, and it had me thinking about, okay, how can I do some of that in my own writing? Right. And, I think we talked about that with Agatha Christie as well, that, she wasn't afraid to talk about things that might have been a little bit more controversial or a little bit more, what are people talking about today?
Exactly. Yeah, I had the same thought. I said, oh, okay, she's doing this too. I mean, in Whose Body, it was 1918 and they were in the middle of the Spanish flu, or I think it had just passed, is kind of the way the book is set. And, she refers to it a few times, and that people are still dealing with that. And exactly, I think that she definitely tackles some deeper topics within what's really, a commercial fiction story. And it is really well done. But you do have to be, like, when we talked about being able to introduce someone to the genre, you could see why that wouldn't be something you'd hand a 10 or 12-year-old. It's a pretty dense read.
Yes, I agree. I hadn't actually read any of her work until we decided we were going to talk about her.
Yeah, same
and I'd
here.
read, lots of Christie and lots of Doyle before that. So I think it's interesting that she's considered one of the classics of the genre, but I don't know how many shelves have a copy of one of her books.
For sure.
It.
Yeah. I was surprised to read, and this is back from that Women of Mystery that we'll link in the show notes, because I refer to it often, but that in 1973, her work had just about been forgotten, but the BBC adapted it into the television series and sort of brought her back from obscurity, which is wonderful because, of course, she is such a pioneer, and especially a female pioneer, that it would have been terrible to have lost some of that history.
Yeah. Well, and she, in this introduction to the Omnibus of Crime, talks about other mystery writers, many of whom I had never come across before. And,
wow.
In reading how she talks about them, I thought, okay, these are some other people that I'd like to read more of. A.A. Milne, who wrote Winnie the Pooh, he was a member of the Detection Club because he
I had no idea.
I know, me neither. But he wrote one or two mysteries, and she talks about him in this piece.
That's neat.
I think that's interesting that obviously some authors who at the time were quite popular who have been all but forgotten. So, maybe that's another thing we can explore in a future episode, right? Talking about some of those forgotten mystery writers.
Yes, definitely. And I think it also speaks to the popularity of the genre. You think about, even in this day and age, there'll be a trend of a genre. And so you'll have writers jump on the bandwagon. Not to say that it was simply for commercial reasons. I don't mean that. But I do think that maybe some of those authors were thinking, oh, well, hey, I want to try my hand at this. I thought it was cute in Whose Body, she turns Sherlocking into a verb. So, Peter Lindsay is Sherlocking about, and she throws that around and sort of pokes fun at the detective fiction a little bit. And I just loved that. It was so much fun. One time he says, no one does that unless they're in a murder mystery. It's just really fun. It's kind of like breaking that fourth wall or whatever. It was adorable. I loved it.
I think it's interesting that in Sayers, she references Doyle, because I caught a couple of references to Sherlock as well. And I can't remember if she referenced Poirot or not.
How fun.
Yeah, I think that she was certainly willing to reference other authors, and we talked about that with Vicky Delaney, right, in her stories.
And they were friends, right, because they were all in the Detection Club together, so they were actually acquainted.
Well, and that just speaks to the history of the supportive author community, right? That it's always been a supportive community.
Oh, yes. I love that.
And that's kind of nice that continues.
For sure. Yeah, I completely agree. That's really neat. Also, sort of like the playing with the detection fiction genre in her work, I found this funny quote by Peter Wimsey, which I feel like we've had a spin-off in contemporary mystery, because he says, "I may be wrong. I hope I am, but I know I'm not." And it reminds me so much of the, you see the meme of Jessica Fletcher, and she says, "I may be wrong, but frankly, I doubt it." I'm like, they just lifted that from Dorothy Sayers. Yeah, I was like, I have to go back and listen to that again. And then I wrote it down. I thought, that's perfect.
Yeah, one of the things I think that I'm enjoying about doing this podcast is getting a deeper understanding of the history of mystery and kind of seeing those connections, that both through the connections of authors who were writing at the same time, but then also just seeing the threads of mystery and the threads of those connections as they're pulled through to modern day or people who are writing now.
Yeah, it's very fun to see that and to learn more about the foundation of it all. Yeah, I really enjoy that part too.
And it just makes me feel like there's so much more to learn.
Every time we open up a subject, then we learn about new authors or new topics, and our list of episodes we want to do just keeps growing. So, well, and I'm really happy to say that we've had some great comments from people that are also enjoying the show. I'd like to just thank them and read some of our comments from listeners. Lori Lewis Ham from Mystery Rats Podcast says, "I highly recommend Mark Aldridge's books on Agatha Christie. They answer some of the questions you brought up in the Christie episode." So I thought that was really great. And we're going to link to that book by Mark Aldridge. And then author J.C. Fuller says, "Great second episode. Interesting points. Bring on episode 3. So we'll just share some of these comments that we get, and please reach out and let us know what you all are thinking.
Brooke, I think this was a really great conversation about Dorothy Sayers. I feel like we've both already said there's a lot more to learn about her, but maybe we've inspired some people who were unfamiliar with her detective fiction to give it a read.
Thank you for joining us today on Clued in Mystery. I'm Brooke.
And I'm Sarah, and we both love mystery. Clued in Mystery is produced by Brooke Peterson and Sarah M. Stephen. Music is by Shane Ivers at silvermansound.com. Visit us online at cluedinmystery.com or social media at Clued in Mystery. If you liked what you heard, please consider subscribing, leaving a review, or telling your friends.